Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archie Viking. Today, I am joined by a friend of mine, Beorn, um, and we're going to talk about. Let me put it this way: we're going to talk about a subject that is totally going to be met in the comments with with nuanced comments and responses, and totally, adult responses, and not, hate. Right, Beorn?
Absolutely. It'll be nothing but nuance and no
Yeah,
reactionary
yeah,
BS,
yeah. No horse shit.
no
Yeah.
emotional responses of any kind.
Yeah. So what we're talking about is a subject that is increasingly over especially the past 10 years or so becoming um is becoming something that's becoming increasingly apparent, I guess is how I'll put it. And that is the the in sort of presence and rise of neo-Nazi groups within the United States, and as well as within the United States military. Not We're not only going to talk about the United States military because really it's also a problem of the United States as a whole. Um, but the United States military, it does exist in the United States military, which is why I invited Bjorn here on because he is a veteran of both the Army and the Navy. So he obviously understands that problem and the degree that it is a problem within these institutions more than I do myself. Um, which actually, let's go ahead and go into that. So, Bjorn, how big of a problem is it in the military? I mean, obviously, not everyone in the military are neo-Nazis or white supremacists, but we do know they exist in there. So, like, what degree is it a problem in these institutions?
So weirdly enough, this is actually something that a lot of people have been asking me about lately.
Hmm.
I think the real answer is it depends on where you look.
Hmm.
Um, you know, at the end of the day, the military is just kind of a microcosm of our society, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
If our society was 100%, progressive leftists, then the military would be 100% progressive leftists, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Now, with that said, the military does skew in a certain direction a little bit, just because historically the military's always been a vehicle for people to
Hmm.
kind of make it out of poverty and into the middle class. So
Yeah.
we're really obviously there's some exceptions to that, right? There's been some rich and famous people join the military, right? Jimmy Stewart was a brigadier general in the Air Force.
Yeah.
Jason Everman from Nirvana was in the Ranger Regiment and Special Forces.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that. That's cool. Yeah.
Things people don't know, but
Yeah.
for the most part, what you're going to see a lot of in the military is people that grow up and they don't have any other way to get out of a bad life.
Hmm.
You find a lot of those people join the military. Um, and you'll get a lot of criticism for that. Oh, they should do it to serve their country. And my only reply to that would be, why don't you go ahead and sign up and don't take the paycheck? Because I'm about as patriotic as a person can get, but I wasn't going to go over there and get shot at without getting a paycheck for it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Um, so I think I don't want to stereotype too much, right? But depending on job field in the military, you're going to find different levels of intelligence, different levels of critical thought.
Hmm.
Uh, you know, I think the average ASFAB score to join the infantry is the lowest requirement in the military, which is not to say all infantrymen are dumb, but in general, you're going to find a lot less critical thinking ability there than you will in intelligence analysis, for instance, right?
Hmm.
And I think critical and systematic thinking are really what we're talking about when we get into white supremacy and this reactionary kind of thinking, right? Unfortunately, I think what that means is you're going to find a lot more of that kind of thought in the guys who are trained to shoot you.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we see it not just in the US, right? The German military
Yeah.
in the last couple of years had to completely dismantle their kind of top tier special operations unit because of this. Um, I think I think you do find a lot of reactionary thinking, like I said, in combat arms in general, and in some ways more so in the kind of cool guy units, the special operations stuff.
Hmm.
In some ways, it's understandable, right? You got guys kind of going out, putting their life on the line for what they believe in, and then coming home and being told what they are. Uh,
Yeah.
I think in a lot of cases, they kind of become what they're expected to become, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can definitely remember just over the years turning into uh, honestly a callous asshole, just because that's what people expected of me, and you can only be accused of something so much before you live up to it if you're not careful.
Yeah.
Uh, but so I think one of the themes of this whole discussion is going to be nuance.
Yeah.
So the
Exactly.
answer to how prevalent is it? How big a problem is it in the military? The answer is it's complicated.
Yeah.
There's plenty of it though,
Yeah.
and that's a problem. I mean, even one is a problem, but there's a lot more than one.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's a good point and jumping off point to talk about, the fact that it also extends throughout the rest of the United States. And of course, uh much like the military, the United States, it depends on where you look. And you could say, like, I'm sure a lot of people watching this are going to be like, well, the South and racism. It's like, well, yeah, and also the Midwest, and that's true, but it's also important to remember it's not just there. The South and the Midwest, while that exists, they get a lot of bad rap for things that happen in other places too. Like, for example, a lot of white supremacists seem to live up around Boston and in certain parts of Pennsylvania. Also, people fly the rebel flag and other things in Eastern California and Eastern Oregon and Washington and such, the more rural parts of those spots, and
Right.
on and on and on. And so we see these places show up. I mean, after all, like uh, while he's not a neo-Nazi, he was most certainly a white supremacist and a xenophobe, a nationalist, and that would be Senator McCarthy from the era of McCarthyism, and he was
Yeah.
from like I forget if it was Indiana or Illinois, but either way, the point is he was from up north and not
Right.
actually from the South. And so I think that's something that's important to point out. Now, people watching may be wondering, why is a history and archaeology YouTuber uh, who is an archaeologist and a historian talking about this? Like, what does this have to do with anything? It's like, well, the reason that we are here today is in bringing this up is because we also want to highlight that this did not come out of nowhere. Unfortunately, this has been a problem pretty much since the beginning. Um, and to prepare for this, Beorn and I, we read the same two books to be on the same page. There's this book right here by Eric Lichtblau, sorry, titled "The Nazis Next Door: um, How America Became a Safe Haven for Hitler's Men." And we'll talk about that in a second. And then also, even though it's not Nazi related, it sort of explains why the things that happened in the Nazis Next Door happened, and that is Education for Extinction, a book about the Native American boarding schools and the boarding school experience. Because what happened at Native American boarding schools, that was Nazi shit. It wasn't,
Absolutely.
yeah, it wasn't. called Nazi shit, but it was most certainly what we if we didn't have the United States name attached to it, it would be called Nazi shit. So so the so how this all happened is again nuanced and complicated. Uh, during shortly after World War II, like almost immediately after World War II, uh, the United States government and military and the OSS, eventually the CIA, for those of you who watching who haven't heard about this, I'm pretty sure that's going to be a few people because this is pretty well known at this point. The OSS was the predecessor to the CIA. Um, Arguably, they're the same entity; they just changed names. But that's a whole nother discussion. But immediately after World War II, a whole bunch of U.S. government officials decided, we care more about fighting the Russians than we care about punishing, war criminals. And so they started to not only bring these people over to the to the United States, and I'm not just talking about Operation Paperclip. The most well-known example of this were Werner von Braun and his scientist associates were brought over to help NASA. There were other examples. Like I think the one that stood out to me the most was an individual by the name of Zukov, who was a Nazi SS officer. And God, Bjorn, you remember this quote? And what did you think of this quote when they said this? They reading it, they're like, "Oh, the CIA said, oh, he only committed minor war crimes." Like,
Yeah,
what the fuck is a minor war crime? It's a war crime. But they
right.
but that's sort of the justification they used, and they brought these people over. And then they started putting them to work in the CIA and the FBI because, of course, J. Edgar Hoover was involved. Um, in fact, I would have been surprised if he wasn't involved, given how influential he was. And then also, this is going to disappoint a lot of people. Uh, George S. Patton was also involved because George S. Patton apparently decided he didn't want the Nazi officials to be unduly mistreated, which is disappointing because, and I still have a respect for him as a military commander because he was undoubtedly one of the best military commanders in World War II. But it's disappointing nonetheless to find out that he essentially didn't give a shit whether or not people who committed atrocities were punished.
He was a genuinely bad human being, in my opinion. If anybody
Yeah, yeah,
doubts and wants a little bit of extra information, go look into the Bonus Army.
yeah,
Where Patton led the charge of active duty cavalry into a group of veterans that were trying for nothing more than to get enough money to live through the Depression. Uh,
exactly.
Killed a bunch of American veterans on American soil.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And it's just so it's not the reason neo-Nazism spread is undoubtedly okay. It's not completely because of that, because I mean, during World War II, there were a whole in the United States there were a whole fuck ton of of Nazi sympathizers. The most famous one being Henry Ford,
Yeah.
also Walt Disney, who was also an anti-Semite.
You also
And
have things like the business plot, which,
yeah,
it's been proven, substantiated, but
yeah.
I do have kind of a hard time thinking that Smedley Butler made that up whole cloth. So,
Yeah, I agree. I feel like that because I mean it's just like it's believable, especially now with what we're seeing here in the United States today with certain individuals who totally didn't make a Nazi salute at all in front of a crowd of cheering, fans. Uh,
yeah.
yeah, it was a Roman salute, which no, it wasn't. I've already done a video on that I'll link in the iCard this YouTube video. But yeah, there was that and so it's so that was already there, but it got exacerbated by the bringing in of these people. And I know what a lot of people are going to be saying, oh, but Werner von Braun and all of his other um cohorts who were Nazi scientists that were brought over, they didn't commit any atrocities. They were just scientists. Not true. Not true at all. In fact, you know, most of them were actually decades later had their citizenship revoked because it was found out that at the Nazi factories that they were building the missiles for the Nazi war machine, they would use slave labor. Yes, Jewish people, but also Romani and other persecuted people. And then they would also, for any minor infraction, hang these enslaved people, um, and brutally execute them in other ways. Um, and then again, the CIA knew about it, and then they just sort of shuffled it under the rug, and were like, "But we need them," even though a lot of people pointed out, it's like, actually, in a lot of ways, our technology was better. Like, for example, Hitler at the same time we were making the atomic bomb. Hitler was trying to make an atomic bomb. However, his scientists were using a far less efficient method. Where we were using one method that was very efficient. I forget what the method was, but the Nazis they were using a method where they were trying to distill what is known as hard water. Um, which, by the way, hard water. It sounds
I mean,
it sounds um like it's something that's like, oh, it's like this caustic thing, or whatever, like liquid oxygen. It's not. You can drink hard water. Hard water is just this weird ionized water where like it's slightly heavier than other water. But it's a tool that could be used for nuclear fission and things like that, but it's far less efficient. You need a ridiculous amount. To do it, uh, and the Nazis could never get up the enough. And you could argue, oh well, that's because the Allies sent in a group of special forces, primarily Norwegians and Swedish special forces, because the factories were in Sweden. Um, to blow up and destroy these hard water factories multiple times, and they succeeded. And yeah, that's certainly part of it. But even before that, they were having trouble actually producing enough to even remotely make enough stuff to make a nuclear bomb. So. So it's like, yeah, their missile stuff was slightly better than ours, but we were way better at them than in other spots. So it could be argued that we didn't really need Werner von Braun and them anyway, especially considering the all the black women who actually helped us get to the moon. Uh, which is the point of the movie Hidden Figures, to talk about those people. But yeah, decades later, it was found out that these individuals had done this, and they were all had their citizenship revoked, with the exception of Werner von Braun, who just happened to be dead at the time. Um, and then there's Zukov, who I talked about, who we talked about, who was made into a CIA agent. And sure, he was eventually determined to to have been a high level SS officer and have lied about being just a low level SS officer, which is again, why does it matter? He was an SS officer, but whatever. And then he was kicked out of the CIA. And then there was another one, forget his name, but there was another one who was even worse, who was like right up there with Heinrich Himmler in level. And the CIA, when Germany and Hungary wanted to try him for war crimes, they moved him out of Europe and then gave him a job in the United States, where he became a well-known citizen in the United States. So it's just Otto von Bolschwig, that's his name. Otto von Bolschwig, who was, again, one of the people who worked with Eichmann and other Heinrich Himmler, to create the final solution. And the CIA not only moved him to America, but they stopped they stopped him from suffering any consequences from the Nuremberg trials, and then moved him into the United States. And this sounds like a conspiracy theory, but it's not, unfortunately. This sounds like the plot to Captain America 2, where Hydra has infiltrated the world and is now, going to end the world if the Avengers don't save it. But this is the real world, and there are no Avengers, and this has happened. You know.
dream fiction.
Yeah, yeah, I know, right? Yeah, it's like I wish it was a fiction, but it's not, you know. Um, Anyway, what were you thinking when you read this, Bill? When we were reading this, Bjorn? Because I know mine was just like I don't want to say it, I wasn't surprised, but it was just sort of like it was just like okay, well, I didn't know that, but it's not, but like it sounds about right. What was your thought process when you were reading that?
I mean, similar. Not surprised, but disappointed. Right? There's a big part of me that desperately wants to believe our national mythos.
Hmm.
Uh, so it always hurts every time I'm forced to confront the fact that we just made that shit up.
Yeah, yeah,
I mean, right from the start, from Manifest Destiny. I mean, really, from even before we were a nation, right? We
yeah,
were we were already writing a myth that was directly contradictory to what we were doing in real life.
yeah.
Uh, One thing I do want to hit on that I think just adds some context to what we're talking about, right? Is I think it's important to note the difference between racism and white supremacy.
Hmm.
Uh, so I would say racism, right, is an inherent belief in the superiority along racial lines, right?
Yeah.
Now, a person does not have to be racist to be white supremacist.
Hmm.
And I think that's something where a lot of people instantly look and they see that word and they say, well, I'm not a Nazi. But white supremacy is a set of policies that may look or sound good on the surface, but disproportionately advantage or disadvantage,
Hmm.
you know, white people or non-white people, right?
Yeah,
Uh,
exactly.
a person doesn't have to be racist to say, I don't want to see government funded healthcare, right? Like
Yeah,
that's just a big part of our national myth. Picking yourself up by the bootstraps, go get a job, get insurance, all that. Look at the systemic factors behind it. That looks and sounds real good on the surface. But when you look at the fact that that is disproportionately hurting, I mean, non-white people across the board,
yeah,
um, and it's nothing to do with race in a lot of people's motivation for it, but the policy in effect still becomes white supremacist, right?
yeah,
Uh, for my part, at least, it's semantics, but I
yeah.
will distinction between racism and white supremacy when I'm talking about these things.
Yeah, yeah, and I agree. And a lot of times it is semantics, and because of course they are, heavily interconnected. And because white supremacists, in the case of the KKK, oftentimes are just racist straight up, anyways. So, but yeah, I think that's a good point to make. Is like it's one of those things where it's like it's it's whether or not it's intended to be racist, it still, causes a disadvantage for for people who are not white. Um, and let's be clear, the Nazis were most certainly racist assholes. To people watching, we're not.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, and it's just well, like I remember there was like in 2023, there not 2023, there was like 2017. Sorry, there was there was a guy in like Wisconsin who was like 90 something years old who it was found out that, oh, guess what? He was one of these Nazis who had, been shuffled into the United States, and he had just lived here unharmed for, decades.
Right.
And and as we were reading this, a lot of the children of these people were saying, oh, they never said a disparaging thing or anything like that to Jewish people or other minorities. And it's like, okay, one, maybe your parents did, and I can get that, uh, maybe your parents didn't, but we can't say that for every single one because it was a lot. And a lot of them, not all of them were necessarily brought by the CIA. I do want to clarify that. A lot of them just simply came here themselves and were able to sort of blend in. Uh, and and things like that, but so yeah, it's like, sure, maybe, like, for example, Otto von Bolschwig's kid was like, he never said anything, bad about Jewish people. Uh, but then he eventually realized, like, okay, well, yeah, but that doesn't change the fact that he did horrible things. And he eventually realized, like, yeah, because he first tried to defend his father, but then eventually he's like, oh no, he most certainly did horrible things, and I need to call that out. And he eventually called that out. But the thing I want to point out is that that doesn't count for everyone. We can't know how many of these Nazis who came over to the United States uh, passed on their ideologies to their children. You know, the because well, like there was this plan, and Bjorn, you know more about this than I do. But there was this plan at the end of World War II where the Nazis created a sort of created that was called Project Warwolf, or was it Werewolf? Either way,
Werewolf. Yeah.
Project Werewolf. And actually, Bjorn, why don't you explain what Project Werewolf was slash sort of is, because you could argue it's still going on now. Um,
It's certainly been revived in an ideological sense, but essentially the point of Operation Werewolf, when the Nazi leadership knew they were going to lose,
mhm.
the Russians are advancing, the Americans are advancing.
Yeah.
What they decided to do was train up people who would go out and blend in and be a part of the local populace and then pop up after the Allies moved through and
Mm,
cause trouble behind the lines, right? A
mm,
traditional, unconventional warfare campaign. Now, as far as I know, this never came to fruition. They never put it into play. I think the Russians moved in before they really got the chance.
mm.
Uh, but the methodology, the ideology behind it is certainly something that survived. Um, it's actually something that our Army Special Forces were built for the same purpose, right? To train up and run a guerrilla army to push unconventional warfare campaigns behind Soviet lines. But the Germans kind of pioneered that with Operation Werewolf. And even at this point, you have some groups that claim not to be racially motivated in any way, but they're still using the same symbol and the same name for their own campaigns.
Yeah.
Uh, you know,
Yeah.
so certainly the methodology and the ideology behind it survived, and the idea of it is being revived and put into play by at least a few groups I know of.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, well, for example, near where Uh, now they've all been prosecuted, so that's why I'm comfortable saying what city they were prosecuted in. But near where I and a couple of mutual friends of ours, mine and Bjorn's, live, in a city called Rome, Georgia, there was a couple years back there was a white supremacist neo-Nazi group that was arrested and prosecuted that was using the symbol of Project Warwolf on their flags. They were also a claim to be like Norse heathens and such, which is unfortunately a subject that Bjorn and I already know well, very well, and we're not going to get into that. But it is something to be of note, um, because it is actually a problem in Norse heathenry a lot, Norse paganism a lot, unfortunately. But yeah, they used that and were eventually prosecuted for it because they were also like seemed to be planning to do something. They were building up a militia and such, which is something we do see across the United States. The largest being like Proud Boys and a couple of others. That exist. And yes, the Proud Boys are white supremacists. They are racist people who are watching, or MAGA people. Deal with it. Stop trying to avoid it. They are what they are. You know.
Yeah, you do yourselves no favors by lying to yourself about the bad people in your midst.
Exactly. Exactly. And it's so yeah, so like Bjorn said, it's like we can see sort of the revival and the continuations of this. And again, we don't know, we can never know completely how many of these not neo-Nazi not neo-Nazis, sir, how many of these top Nazi officials that filtered into the United States were passing this ideology on and were, perhaps like, okay, maybe let's readapt this and see if we can, rot the beast from within. Uh, and and yes, I'm saying this is all speculation, but it's not a huge leap to assume, especially given what we've seen again in the past 10 years or so. And to be fair, neo-Nazi groups have been around for decades. I mean, that's what the movie American History X was about. With um you know what's this uh anyways, I don't forget the
Edward
guy Edward Norton. Thank you, Edward Norton. I was trying to think. Yeah, but yeah, with Edward Norton, that's what it was about. But it's increased in the past 10 years. You could argue the past 20 years, but especially within the past 10 years, uh, it's increased. And and I think that's a good point to jump off to continue into the next point is like like we said, this didn't come out of nowhere. A lot of people, you could argue, oh, but it just came up in World War II, the 1930s. No, it's been there for a while, and that's because of the United States's policy against Native Americans, and also again the Jim Crow South and their policy against the indigenous Filipinos during the Philippine American War. But most broadly, the policy, their policy towards Native Americans, which Hitler overtly stated was one of his inspirations for his Lebensraum plan. It was like, hey, let's expand out, and act like the United States and concentration camps and death camps. Yes, there is a difference. Auschwitz and Dachau were death camps, not concentration camps. But concentration camps and death camps were directly inspired by Native American reservations. Um, and and that's a tough conversation to bring up to people because people tend to think that the Nazis came out of nowhere, that they just sort of appeared in the 1930s, but this ideology has existed for a long while. um the United the
discussing how the Nazis were able to come to power too, right? Like
yeah,
it's not like you just had a big nation full of racist shitheads that all
yeah,
decided to vote Hitler.
yeah,
What you had is a lot of people with a lot of resentment after World War One because of Germany's economic state,
yeah,
and they took some valid complaints. Right, there were a couple of very high profile Jewish banking families that made a huge profit by financing both sides of World War One.
hmm,
And the Nazis were able to take those couple of examples and generalize that to the entirety of Jewish people. And that's how they were able to turn people's resentment that a lot of times they didn't even realize they had into
yeah,
murderous rage. Uh,
exactly,
and I think we've seen the same thing happen here in a lot of ways. You know, a lot of people had valid complaints and valid resentments, and
hmm,
it's just been manipulated slowly over time to turn people that I mean, shit, people that I knew 20 years ago to be reasonable, thoughtful, kind, loving
yep,
people
yeah.
into frothing, mad, racist shitheads.
Yep, same here. That's exactly the same thing here. And yeah, exactly. And we can also talk about World War One because yeah, Germany took a lot of the blame. And sure, Germany is not blameless in World War One, but neither is anyone else. World War One is this weird World War One, just to give a brief thing before we get back to the Native American reservations thing and the United States policy against Native Americans. World War One is this thing where it's just was a perfect storm because prior to that, the decades prior to that, European countries had been making these series of alliances with each other, and then there was increasing tensions with different sets of European nations and such, to the point where like Russia is arguably the one who actually sort of set it into motion, because Russia, one had the Russo-Japanese War where they got defeated by Japan pretty handily, by the Japanese Empire pretty handily, and then after that, uh, the Romanovs decided, the Tsar specifically decided that he was going to build his military and I quote, a period in preparatory before war, which is sort of like, okay, but what war? You just ended a war. Like, what war are you preparing for? Um, and then he just sort of increased that tensions, and then that caused nations like Austria-Hungary and such at the borders of Russia to increase their military. And then, of course, that led to things like the Serbian issues within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then eventually the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, and then that led to war. And then the Austria-Hungary went to war with Russia because Russia declared war on them, and then Germany, now because they had an alliance with Austria-Hungary, is like, well, I guess I got to go defend my ally. And then because they were both attacking Russia, which had signed an alliance with France, France is like, well, I guess I got to go defend my ally. And it was just a continuous domino of people of countries fulfilling obligations to treaties that led into eventually what we saw in World War One, and then Germany just got scapegoated for something that all they were doing was just backing up their ally in fulfilling the terms of their treaty. you know. So again, they, like you said, Germany had some degree of valid criticisms. They're like, hey, why the hell were we the only ones punished for this? Like, why are we
And so
disproportionate?
initially that it literally crippled an entire
Yeah,
nation.
exactly. Exactly. While Austria-Hungary and Russia, the countries that started the conflict, were not, well, so Russia, of course, had its Russian Revolution, but the point is, it uh for one thing, during the Great Depression, the only nation that actually sort of recovered was the USSR, because of their policies. And we're not going to get into discussions about communism and capitalism because that's not necessarily what happened, because there were other communist countries that were rising that also suffered because of the Great Depression. So it's again a nuance. Same with capitalism. Capitalism, some countries were doing better and some countries were suffering, like the United States was suffering. So again, it's that's not a communism versus capitalism argument. That's just sort of like who had the better infrastructure, to go back to that argument. But the point is, other nations were not actually punished for their actions, but Germany was. Um, but so that again, that was part of it, definitely part of it. But a huge chunk of it was the United States policy against Native Americans. Um, because we see this systematic genocide that the Nazis specialized in the United States policy. There was the Indian removal, where uh, a lot of times when you hear Indian removal, you think of the Cherokee Nation being removed on the Trail of Tears, and that was certainly part of it, but that was only a singular part of it. There was basically every Native American nation east of the Mississippi was forcibly removed to Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska, what was known as Indian Territory. And they were moved at gunpoint, and some sure fought back. The Muscogee Creek fought back in the Second Creek War. The Seminole fought back in the Second Seminole War. The Second Fox fought back in Black Hawk's War, but that ended horribly for them. Entire massacres happened, and then at the same time as the United States was expanding west into the Great Plains, they were pretty much most of the time uh, committing atrocities, unprompted. Like, or maybe there would be like, oh, there's a raid where somebody, where a war party of, say, Cheyenne stole a couple of horses and one white guy got killed, and then that would result in, for example, an event known as the Sand Creek Massacre, where the United States cavalry rode into a village of mostly unarmed Cheyenne children, and elderly people, and proceeded to brutally massacre them, to the point where even some U.S. soldiers were horrified at the actions. Or there's also and this, of course, will probably surprise no one. When George Armstrong Custer was a colonel, he led the U.S. cavalry into a village headed by the Cheyenne leader Black Kettle on the Washita River, and proceeded to massacre a whole bunch of primarily unarmed Cheyenne women and children in what became known as the Battle of Washita. And he actually bragged about his actions in multiple reports. Um, Absolutely horrific stuff. But it isn't even just that. They also there's also the systematic extermination of the American bison, which was explicitly done to deprive Native American peoples of the Great Plains of food. And this was put into motion by General William Tecumseh Sherman. Well, and also other generals, but William Tecumseh Sherman is sort of the first one who brought it up. He was like, "Hey, this might be a good idea." But what was insidious about his thing is he didn't just order the United States military to do it. He also suggested to invite a bunch of white American and white British hunters onto the Great Plains, like Buffalo Bill Cody, to hunt as many American bison as they could. Um, and again, under the policy of starving the Native American nations and forcing them to leave the Great Plains, upon which they then led entire armies to forcibly remove entire communities to Native American reservations. And, so the, let me put it this way. If I didn't say the United States and Native Americans repeatedly and I just left the details obscured, that sounds a lot like something that the Nazis would do because that's what they did. And because again, guess what? They got it from us. In part. I want to make clarify the German Empire is by no means uh, blameless because the German Empire also committed a genocide in West Africa prior to World War One that Hitler also got and Himmler also got the ideas from.
Yeah.
But the United
Well,
States was definitely
yeah,
a part of it.
the Belgians, King Leopold in the
Yep,
Congo.
yep, exactly.
But I think a lot of that speaks to kind of rolling back around to the military side of things. One of the most effective things that a military trainer can do
Hmm.
is instill a sense of dehumanization of an
Yeah,
enemy, even predicted enemy, right? Like
yeah,
if if we were doing that right now, we might look and say, I think the next war we're going to fight is against the Chinese, and
yeah,
so you kind of start slipping in. We don't call them people, we don't call them Chinese, we call
hmm,
them, whatever racial epithet, right?
yeah,
When I was in, we didn't talk about Arabs and Iraqis. We talked about ragheads and camel jockeys, right?
yeah,
Um, that makes it easier to think of someone as not being a human, and that makes it a lot easier to do horrible, horrible things to.
yeah, exactly, exactly. And that's, and that's really the policy of the United States against Native Americans throughout their entire time. Well, in fact, let me see here. Let me find a quote here. So I'm going to read a quote from this book right here titled Black Kettle, the Cheyenne Chief Who Sought for Peace But Found War. So we're going to read sort of the dehumanizing and horrible things that the United States did to the Cheyenne in the Sand Creek Massacre. And this is on page 161 of the book. And this is an excerpt from a letter sent by, let's see, what's his name? Sent by Captain Silas S. Sewell to Major Ned Wincup, where he says, and I quote, I tell you, Ned, it was hard to see little children on their knees have their brains beat out by men professing to be civilized. One squaw was wounded, and a fellow took a hatchet to finish her. She held her arms up to defend her. He cut one arm off and held the other with one hand and dashed the hatchet through her brain. One squaw with two children were on their knees begging for their life. for their lives of a dozen soldiers, within 10 feet of them, all firing. When one succeeded in hitting a squaw in the thigh, when she took a knife and cut the throats of both children and then killed herself. One squaw hung herself in the lodge where there was not enough room for her to hang. She held up her knees and choked herself to death. Some tried to escape on the prairie, but most of them were run down by horsemen. White Antelope wore bonnet, and a number of others had ears and privates cut off. Squaws' privates were cut out for trophies. You would think it impossible for white men to butcher and mutilate human beings as they did, but every word I've told you is the truth, which they don't deny. Again, that is straight up Nazi shit. That is some of the most horrific shit you could read. And to the credit of Captain Sewell, he was horrified. And I want to clarify this: not every U.S. soldier was like this. There are quite a number of examples of U.S. soldiers going back to, um, you know, to the inception of the United States. For example, in the Creek War. Um, at the first Creek War of U.S. soldiers being horrified at the actions of the U.S. military. But that's unfortunately the thing is the U.S. military and the U.S. government was still having these things ordered to happen. Uh,
Yeah.
and that's and it's like you said, it's like they dehumanized these people to make it easier. And it didn't necessarily always work because again, like Captain Silas Sewell pointed out, um, even he was like, hey, we're claiming to be civilized, but we're committing this horrible act against these people who are literally begging for their lives. And so that's sort of one of the cruxes of my point is that like we act like the Nazis are unique or were unique, but they weren't. The United to quote the meme of the Nazis looking at each other saying, "Are we the baddies?" Yeah, that's the US. Like, are we the baddies? Yes, to a lot of people we are the baddies. Now, I'm not saying that because one of the things that the right likes to say, oh, you're making Americans feel bad about themselves. No, we modern Americans don't need to feel bad about our personal selves, but we do need to point out what the United States has done in the past and in many ways still continues to do to Native Americans because there's the missing and wounded there's the missing uh women and indigenous person and epidemic. Native Americans still disproportionately get murdered and raped and other things throughout the United States. And people are still trying to take away their culture, as seen with when a few years ago when the Indian Child Welfare Act was attempted to be overturned, which was put into place because Native American children were forcibly removed from their parents, in homes for decades to be put in wealthy white people's homes because they,
Right.
wanted Native American children to convert them. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Them and teach them to be white.
Yeah, exactly. Which is always what it was like, and that's another thing, why do you might be asking, like, well, what about the boarding schools? Why do you say that that was Nazi shit? Well, let's read what one of the discipline because so one, these schools were specifically set up to force Native Americans to send their children to them to convert them and air quotes civilize them and assimilate them into white American life. And parents did resist. A lot of times they refused to send their children to these places, but a lot of times it was not did not end well for them. For example, 14 Hopi men in the 1890s were arrested and sent to Alcatraz. Yes, Alcatraz. Um, because they refused to send their children to these Native American boarding schools. And then you have other cases where, like, there was the Dawes Act, where Native American land was essentially torn up and divided, and given to a whole bunch of white American settlers. For those of you who uh, we don't know what that is, watch the last quarter uh was it Far and Away with Tom Cruise and Natalie Kidman. Uh
Yeah.
Nicole Kidman, we're like so towards the end of it, they're having a race to in Oklahoma to get land. Yeah, that was the Dawes Act. you know,
Yeah.
yeah, and so so it's like, oh yeah, they're getting their own land, and yada yada. Yeah, but they're also taking away Native American land. It was land that the United States signed in a treaty to multiple different Native American nations, and they were like, ah, sorry, take back seas, It's like we didn't mean to give you these rights. And then anytime any Native American protested to that, they would get executed, like or jailed or anything like that. For example, a Cherokee elder, Ned Christie, in the 1890s protested this, or 1880s protested this, and then he was framed for murder, and then subsequently declared an outlaw and hunted down and killed by a posse of United States Marshals. Um, and so yeah, this was a wholesale attempt to just steal everything from them and assimilate them, uh, and say if you're not white, you don't need to be here. Again, does this anybody watching? Does this sound familiar? It's like, does this sound familiar to anyone? Um, but
And
but
it's worth noting, I think, this is still not some kind of uniquely American thing,
no,
right? Like
no, yeah,
a lot of people watching will point out, well, other countries did the same thing. Absolutely, right? The British in Ireland were
yep,
well known for beating children to death for speaking their native tongue or playing their
yeah,
national sport, curly, right?
yeah,
Um, again, earlier I mentioned the Congo, right? Under King Leopold, they pioneered dismemberment as a form of punishment for small infractions, and that's still being used all over Africa today by various and sundry insurgent groups, right? They'll just
yeah,
roll into with a machete. Um, so these things are not uniquely American, but we got the idea from somewhere,
yeah.
and we damn sure did a lot of it.
Yeah, well, and the United and other places certainly got the idea from somewhere. Us, and of course, well, like the Japanese Empire committed atrocities, in a lot of places prior to World War I. I mean, they occupied Korea for decades prior to World War I, and also parts of China, and committed atrocities there. Um, and and they most certainly got some of that from us. Of course, a lot of it was their own, but they certainly got some of it from us and from other places. um so yeah, it's not unique, but the whole point is, like, the United States, we act like everyone acts like the United States is a unique place where this stuff doesn't happen, but it does, and it's always been there, and so, again, like we see, forms of punishment that you would see at work camps and concentration camps, at these Native American boarding schools. And so, like, for example, we have this one. This actually is not an account of a Native American person themselves. This is a report of what happened to a Native American student by the Indian Rights Association, written in 1903, where the report states, and I quote, Virginia Weeks, the pupil in question, wasn't. Oh, sorry. Let me clarify real quick. This is in Education for Extinction, by David Wallace Adams, and it's on pages 132 and 133. Anyways, the report reads, Virginia Weeks, the pupil in question, was an orphan of the Pawnee tribe, about 18 years of age, of rather fragile body, she being consumptive. For those of you who don't know, that means she had tuberculosis. Back then, they called it consumption. Um, the girl's testimony was that in punishment for the offense, the superintendent took her to his private office and locked the door so that no one could witness the chastisement, that he beat her with a yardstick, throwing her to the floor and jerking her about. Finally took her to the laundry where the offense was committed, demanding that she apologize to the employee with whom she had the difficulty. This she refused to do. The superintendent then took her to the barn where he could not be seen, and he beat her with a strap about 5 feet long, with which he held the loose ends in his hand so that the doubled portion could be applied to her body. After beating her with the strap for some time, he again asked her if she was willing to apologize. Still refusing, the superintendent continued the whipping until he beat her into submission, whereupon he returned to the laundry, and she repeated the words, after him, the words of apology demanded. So, in other words, she did nothing wrong, and the superintendent still brutally abused her until she admitted to wrongdoing. Um, see here, and then there's another example on page 353 of the of Education for Extinction, where it's a personal account of a Potawatomi student named Julia Harding, where she refused to go to an outing, and the see here, when she refused to cooperate, the school disciplinarian Claude Stoffer uh, stated that let's see here, is it, okay, three, that's and 354. Sorry, was that? No, okay, that was wrong. Oh, yeah, there we go. Uh, let's see here. Yeah, he said you must go to the country, and when he refused to cooperate, he it's like you were going. He said you were going to go sign the check and go out to the country, and when she refused, Stoffer jerked a board down from the window sills and punched. She says jerked a board down from the window sills, and he punched me down on the floor, and two of the matrons held me. Miss Ridenor was one, and I don't know who the other was. They put down the curtains so that nobody can see me see in, and they lock the door. And I want to make clear that's the tamest quotes I could find. There are worse quotes in there involving sexual assault, all kinds of things. There's one that was like, oh, it's a whipping line where they would all where the headmaster would pull off his belt and everybody would walk in line and he would brutally beat them. Um, yeah, and again that's the tamest ones I could find because there's a darker aspect of Native American boarding schools and that a lot of people, well, fortunately in the past 4 years have learned about it, but not a lot of people knew about. And that's that children died at these places. Uh,
And
often
huge.
in huge amounts. Like combined in both the United States and Canada, there is and this is a rough estimate because they still don't know what the final count is. Tens of thousands of children died in these institutions and were left in unmarked graves. And only back in 2020, uh, in 2019, were they, finally being starting to be talked about and were great, children's uh, graves finally being repatriated to their family members. And this is not something that happened a while ago. This is something that happened relatively recently. To put this in perspective, most of these boarding schools and these residential schools in Canada only closed down in the 90s and the 80s. There are people alive who went there and or who also know family members who went there. Uh, so these are horrific places, but it doesn't just stop there. Again, here's some stuff that is Nazi shit. The people there would, for example, one form of corporal punishment was withholding food. They would starve children. Uh, Another one is they would, while withholding the food, they would perform experiments to see how much nutrition a person could go without before they needed to be fed. Native American women would be forcibly sterilized. And I want to point out that these things are not unique to Native Americans. 'Cause these things would also happen to African Americans and other minority groups as well. I mean, there's a reason that the Tuskegee experiments are so well known. You know, uh, and so that's sort of that. It all goes back to the sort of the point is that like the Nazis were not unique. The Nazis got a lot of their ideas from the United States. And in contrast, the United States is not unique in, one is not unique in its methods, but also it's not unique in that it's not always been some haven of of freedom for everybody. It's not always been the place that is like people like to quote the or like to misquote the castle on the hill or whatever the hell the quote is. Um the Bible quote is. Uh, like it's not always been that. I mean, it's been that for white people, but other groups not so much. Other groups we have been the boogeyman, where it's like, oh no, the United States is coming. And I know that's hard for people to hear, but it's the truth. And again, it doesn't mean that we can't love our country. It doesn't mean that we should feel like we are horrible people by proxy. It just means that we
No,
need
but
to
we should
acknowledge
love
it.
our country enough to want it to be better,
Exactly. Exactly.
right? I think America should try to live up to that national myth we have.
Yeah.
We should try to be what we claim to be.
Hmm.
We're not
Ex-
doing that.
no, no, we aren't. I mean, there have been times where like it looked like we might be going that way, but we're not. And it's, and part of the reason we're also talking about this is because the stuff we're talking about is now the current administration is trying to erase. They don't want us to talk about the stuff that quote again quote makes white Americans feel bad or white children feel bad, and that's like one that doesn't happen. Okay, for let me to point out all the stuff that I talk about. I've gotten multiple books that are still age appropriate for my son, but books for my son that talk about these things. Like my son just, we had him read things about, the Trail of Tears and Indian removal, the Crystal Knot, um, slavery. Recently he got done reading multiple books that were for kids about the Japanese internment and what bullshit that was. And on Reconstruction. And you know what didn't happen in all of that time? He didn't feel bad. He didn't feel like that it was his fault. And nor did I make him feel like it was his fault. But what I did was say, okay, you know that what we're reading about was something that was terrible and shouldn't have happened, right? He's like, yeah. I'm like, that there you go. And I'll ask him other things about like what happened and things like that to make, typical school things to make sure he, actually absorbed the content. But the whole point it wasn't to make him feel bad. The whole point was to like, hey, this happened and it shouldn't have happened. And I think that's something. Well, and let me say that Republicans know that their children aren't going to feel bad for this shit. They just don't want it talked about. That's the problem. MAGA doesn't want it talked about because they don't want people to know about it. That's all it is. It's not a feel bad thing, and so we don't want to talk about it. It's we don't talk about the creepy uncle in the corner who's hitting on the 16-year-old at the party. You know, that's essentially what it is. Sometimes quite literally. Epstein. Anyways, but sometimes quite literally. Um, and I know Bjorn, you agree. It's like we can talk about these things, and it doesn't make you feel bad. It shouldn't make you feel bad for yourself, at least. Uh,
I can have empathy for the people who went through that and still not make it my fault, right?
exactly. Yeah.
I never owned a slave. I never committed a war crime. You know, uh,
Hmm.
I never did any of these things, and I'm not going to feel guilty as if I did. And I can still have compassion and empathy for the people that went through that.
Yeah.
And I think that's where we need to get to as a society.
Exactly, exactly. Well, and of course, you mentioned empathy, but now you know uh, what a certain wannabe comic book supervillain has said before. Empathy is the great weakness of Western society. Meanwhile, he's also complaining about people making fun of his company falling under.
Right. Well, you know what? I'll just go back and I'll say sympathy instead of empathy. How's that?
Yeah,
I'm sure how I feel about the concept of empathy, right?
yeah.
You can't feel someone else's emotions. So that one's actually a little bit weird for me. But sympathy, yes, I can feel bad for people who go through bad shit.
Exactly, exactly. And yeah, yeah, and that's the whole point. It's just like and so it like
Well, I
and
can even want to help them.
yeah, exactly. Can even want to help them. And that's why
I,
it's in,
one of the big problems that we see when it comes to American society is we can feel bad and we can want people to get help, but it's always somebody else's job to help.
yeah,
Somebody to help those poor people, but it's never me that ought to.
yeah, exactly. Or like, oh, what about the children? Meanwhile, fuck the children, apparently. So, it's like, yeah, and that's exactly it. And so it's mentalities like that it's policies like the United States policies against Native Americans and also other minority groups like Hispanics, Asians, the African Americans, etc., that made it possible for what the book The Nazis Next Door describes happened to happen. It's what made it possible for not only the CIA, the FBI, and top-ranking U.S. military officials to move high-ranking Nazi officials, and of course a lot of regular Nazi soldiers into the United States. It made that possible, but it also made it possible for them to blend in and remain relatively undiscovered for a large period of time because in a lot of ways they were like just like a lot of Americans here. And I'm not saying that is like, oh, people Americans didn't realize that. No, look up in the 1930s rallies celebrating Hitler in the United States. Like there's one particular video where it's like a huge crowd, huge banners and everything, and like and a lot of people who watch, oh, that's Nazi Germany. It's like, nope, that's in the United States. A lot of people really liked Hitler in the United States. In fact, we up until World War II, the how we did the Pledge of Allegiance was it wasn't called the Nazi salute at the time, but it was the Nazi salute. Again, look it up, you know.
Yep.
Yeah, so, and it wasn't just the United States. A lot of countries did it. It was a specific like gesture that no wasn't a Roman salute, but it was still a specific gesture, that was just a commonly used gesture. But then the Nazis really used it, and so did fascist Italy, and I believe fascist Spain too. But I'm not sure on that, you know. But the
Um,
point is,
we
what were you?
still use that as a mass salute, like a marching salute.
Oh, really?
A lot of militaries from nations that we wouldn't consider friendly. So if you look at videos of like the North Korean
Oh, yeah,
parade,
yeah.
that's not uncommon in certain parts of the world. But also, if you look at the nations where that's being used, that's definitely people where I wouldn't want to be friends with their leaders.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And that's my point. Is that it was widely used and still is widely used, but widely used up until World War II, and then a whole lot of countries were like, okay, maybe we should not do this anymore because of what they're doing. And so that's where, like, for example, the United States put the hand on your left pec or over your heart, whatever you want to call it, during the Pledge of Allegiance, and such comes from. But that's again, that's the point is, a lot back then, and also still to this day, a lot of people most certainly were very similar to the Nazis, and that's what allowed the Nazis to blend in, and arguably, allowed the Nazi movement to survive in secret, and or not a very well kept secret, but in secret nonetheless, up until this, they could sort of proliferate out like they're the fucking fungus in The Last of Us throughout the United States. You know, um,
I think just on the topic of things like that salute,
yeah,
I hear a lot of people talk about like, well, we got to take it back. We can't let the Nazis have it. And I think there's a valid position to be had there, but it's not on that salute. Like, I
yeah,
think we have to look and see whether something is worth taking back, whether it's actually got any real meaning, right?
yeah,
Uh, you know, uh, for instance, Germanic runes have been associated with some Nazi shit,
yeah,
and all of those are of a meaningful enough nature to me that I'm willing to fight the fight to take those back. Uh,
exactly.
Salute doesn't mean anything to me or to anyone else in this country other
Yeah.
than a Nazi salute, and there's no good reason to try to quote take that back.
Well, yeah, and by that same extension, the swastika was prior to the Nazis using it. And still to a certain degree, and I'll get to that in a second, but prior to the Nazis using it was a symbol used by multiple different cultures, including Native Americans, that symbolized things like the four directions, the four elements and things like that. However, and also East Asian religions such as Buddhism and Hinduism. However, there's nuance to that. For one thing, most of those cultures don't want to take it back. Like the Native American nations that used it explicitly and have continued to explicitly say, like, nope, we're not going to use that anymore. Like, we
Yeah,
understand.
it's not hard to make
Yeah,
a slightly different sun wheel that serves the same
yeah.
purpose.
And in the case of Buddhism and Hinduism, they use it, but they also use it in such a different way than what the Nazis used it. That it's like that that I don't want to say they get away with it because it was originally theirs anyway. But the point is they're using it in such a specific way that it's not having the same effect. They use it in very specific religious purposes, and spiritual purposes, not as a symbol where they're waving it around on a flag, you know, and trying to act like we're taking it back. They're like, no, for one thing, they didn't need to take it back. It was theirs to begin with, because that's another thing. Um, White supremacists, really loved to appropriate a lot of East Asian culture without actually keeping the context of what it was about. Looking at you, Shangri-La, but um, and Nirvana, uh, but it's not the same. That's really what it is. It's just not the same. They're not taking it back because they didn't need to take it back, and it's not even used in the same way. So there's no reason for them to even think about doing that. And I think that's the key, is that a lot of people are like, we can take this back. It's okay, but if you're going to be using it in a similar way, or if it's something that's too far gone, you know, why bother?
Yeah.
You're just going to cause undue harm. So, what were you saying, Bjorn?
I just said, is it worth taking it back? That's the question we
Yeah,
always have to ask. Like, look, some fights just aren't worth fighting.
yeah,
That's simple, right? There's a lot of people in the South who look at a quote rebel flag, and
yeah,
there's a lot who genuinely do see it as a symbol of regional pride, not racism.
yeah, yeah,
So that's got a wide enough cultural meaning that it is not worth fighting that fight, right? I have plenty of regional pride. I was born and raised in the South.
yeah. Same here. Yeah.
And also, there are just better ways to show that pride. I don't need to
Ex-
fight a fight to try to take that flag back.
Yeah, exactly. Especially when the flag still causes undue harm to African American and other marginalized communities. Like, oh, and by the way, people watching, yes, the Civil War was fought over fucking slavery. It's not even up for debate. Sorry you're upset about it. I have, a lot. I made 3 videos on that recently, and a lot of people from the South came out of the woodworks upset and trying to say heritage, not hate, and lost cause, and yada yada yada. Sorry, it very much was. Again, it
Well,
doesn't
the
mean you.
lost cause was a civilization, right? And that civilization was built on the backs of
Yeah,
slaves.
yeah,
That kind
exactly.
of makes it about slavery. Another one of the big ones I hear a lot is, well, it was fought over money. And that's
We're,
fundamentally true. It was a war fought to determine what was going to be the
yeah,
dominant economic system in a country. But when you're talking about money in the context of slavery, I guess we'll call that human capital, if I can be real callous for a moment.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Equal money. So, yeah, it was fought over money in the form of, fucking slaves.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's just, yeah, exactly. So we don't need, like it's just, yeah, and that's the point of that, is like, every argument they can come up with. It's like, oh, but it was fought over the states' rights, so what? It was fought over the economy, and their economy was built on what? Like it's like, you know it's it sort of reminds me of that scene from Billy Madison, Adam Sandler's Billy Madison, where he's talking with Chris Farley, and Chris Farley's like, "Yeah, I did this and this and that." And it's like, "No, you didn't." Yeah, no,
Oh,
no, I didn't. But I did this and this and that. No, you didn't. Yeah, you're right. No, I didn't. But I could have. No, you couldn't have. Yeah, you're right. And that's exactly what this is. It's like anything you can come up with, we can be like, no, or like, or okay, but what does it lead back to? And so
right.
that and that's again goes back to what we're talking about in the broader thing. It's like what does it all lead back to? Like what does it all, you know, lead back to? And it leads back to hate is not unique. Hate is not unique to the Nazis. Um, it's not. It's while it's disappointing, it's not surprising that the neo-Nazis have been able to thrive to such a degree in the United States and in the United States military, and it all and it's all has a lot to do with how the United States and other imperial powers uh, acted and continue to act. Because yes, the United States is still an empire. I've heard the argument that it's not because technically we're a hegemony because technically we have territories, not colonies. Like they're the same fucking thing, just by a different name. Hawaii, uh, Puerto Rico, Guam, the U.S. Virgin Islands, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, are all still our colonies that we acquired via war. So
But as long as we continue to extract massive profit from
yeah.
other countries via unbalanced trade agreements imposed
Mhm.
with the threat of military force, we're acting as a de facto empire.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.
Right? Like
And
you're not going to say no to the trade agreement when we have put an air force base in the middle of your country.
yeah, exactly. It's it's literally give us your money or else. And yeah, exactly. And so that's I keep saying it, but I can't say it enough. It's like hate is not unique. Not the Nazis are not unique, and the United States' policy and policies, both in the past and in the present, are what has allowed these groups to thrive and survive. And yeah, because I think it's the perfect analogy, given that the show is still happening. It's like again, it's like the fungus in The Last of Us. It's built up and then it's burst and is spread throughout the rest of the United States. And we're having trouble fighting it off. I think we will in the end succeed, but it's going to be a tough fight. And here's sort of how I want to end the video on, because I think this is a perfect thing to end the video on. The reason we are doing this video is to highlight it, because there's this thing that when you look at fascist governments, um, like the Nazis, but not just the Nazis, really authoritarian governments in general, even like communist or some people argue communist in name only countries like Cuba, Maoist China, and China now, and the USSR and such, is this thing called obeying in advance. These authoritarian
Yes.
governments are able to thrive because people obey in advance. They obey you, and they think it's not worth it enough to fight back. And a lot of times, if they had just, it's the opposite. If they had just spoken out a little bit, even a little bit, and enough of them had done that over time, you know, then it would have stopped it. But they didn't, because they didn't want to cause trouble. And that's obeying in advance. People don't want, again, the administration doesn't want us talking about subjects like this. They don't want us talking about the history of the United States' policies against Native Americans. They don't want us talking about the history of the United States supporting the Nazis prior to entering World War II. They don't want us talking about, the United States government helping high-ranking Nazi officials into the United States and letting them off essentially scot-free. They don't want us talking about that. But you know what? If we don't talk about that, that allows them to further sweep it under the rug. That allows them to gain more power. And so we're not going to do that. Essentially, fuck you, we're going to talk about it anyway. It's like that's all we can say is we're going to talk about it anyway, because talking about it is in some small form resistance. We are resisting you. There are multiple ways to do a resistance. There's a great activist who's a veteran that I follow, who along with a cohort of other veterans, um, follows and gathers information on neo-Nazi groups and prosecutes them with the help of the U.S. Of the U.S. government. Um, I don't know, Bjorn, if you've ever heard of him, but he's Christoph Goldsmith. I would recommend looking
Yeah,
into him. Yeah, you've heard of him? Uh,
yeah,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, Christoph Goldsmith. And that's one of the things he pointed out. He's like, look, resistance can take on many forms. Like he said, he's like, look, you don't have to do what I do. He's like, I worry about veteran affairs and, fighting neo-Nazi groups. You can say, if you care about women's reproductive rights, do that. If you care about this, do that. And so that's what we're doing. We care about the history of the stuff. We care about why this stuff is happening and making sure it doesn't get swept under the rug. And so that's what we're doing now. And so I want to leave it to be like, hey, more people, when you need to watch this, you need to talk about this and, and make sure that more people know about it and can, shine a light on it because shining a light on it, uh, it makes them uncomfortable. They hate it and it makes them stumble. It makes them, not be able to defend themselves even more and more. Even when they are coming at you with, and I'm just going to go ahead and just throw, say it, even when they're coming after you with insults that are very clearly shows that they grew up in the 70s and 80s and 90s, such as, "Oh, you live in your mom's basement," is one argument I've heard, which is sort of just like, "Do you not have any other insults?" But anyways, but like don't obey in advance. Just don't. Just you talk about it. Fight back about it. You don't have to resisting doesn't have to look like you're going to the Capitol in a mass protest. I mean, certainly do that. That's a good idea. I think that's a certain an important aspect of it, but it doesn't have to be that. If you can't do it, you can do something like Bjorn and I are doing. You can talk about this and you can, put it on YouTube or some other place and really make sure that this doesn't get swept under the rug because history matters. You can get books like The Nazis Next Door or Education for Extinction. I highly recommend. Or you can get, like I quoted here, Black Kettle, the Cheyenne chief who sought peace but found war. Or I'd mentioned the Washita Battle of Washita. You can get this right here. This is a primary book document that you can get online. It's all primary documents, firsthand accounts of the Battle of Washita, called Washita Memories, Eyewitness views of Custer's attack on Black Kettle's village. These things you can get and you can learn about it. Just learning about it will make you give you weapons to fight back. So yeah, I think that's really just the end of it. It's like we need to fight back, and you can fight back, and don't obey in advance. Talk about this stuff, and I will cite all of these books in the description of this YouTube video. And with that, thank you for everyone for watching. If you would like to see me and Bjorn talk about any other subject related to this in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. Um, and real quick, Bjorn, do you have any final statements you want to say?
um, really, I just want to give a little piece of advice, right? Really, you touched on it, but you can't fight every battle, right? So you pick the things that are meaningful to you, and you stand up for them. And that doesn't have to be marching on Washington. It doesn't have to be taken to the hills with a rifle, just so we're clear, right? It
Yeah,
can be something as simple as, I smoke cigars in town with a bunch of my redneck cohort here, and I can sit and have a cigar and a civil conversation and push back on, some economic or ideological discussion I disagree with without being a slavering asshole about it
yeah,
and get to think. And it
yeah,
can be that simple, just a small form of resistance.
exactly, exactly. So yeah, so like I said, if you want to see us to, I think one well said words from Bjorn, and if you want to see us discuss any of these things in greater detail later in later videos, leave a comment in the comment section, like, share, and subscribe, and all of y'all have a good day. And thank you, Bjorn, for coming on, as always. Uh,
Thanks.
yeah,